Brad, and it's awesome to be here and to spend the day in this environment. And I just was commenting how inspiring it always is to be at Studio and to really see your take on issues and big opportunities and the ideas that emerge. So as Brad mentioned, at this time last year, December 1, actually, Tory announced that I was to be the next CEO of CivicAction. And I have to tell you that the interview process to become the CEO of CivicAction took well over 2 months. And multiple interviews. I believe I had at least 4. The final interview, there were 6 people in the room. And Tory led the charge in grilling me and asking me questions. So today I get to turn the tables.
Take your best shot.
I will. So my first question to you, John, how has the week been? What's your take on it?
Well, of course, nowadays I'm a talk show host, so that if you're a talk show host a week like this, it's just manna from heaven. I have no further comment.
Did John also mention that he is a former politician? So good answer, John.
I thought both resumes they read out sounded like 2 people who can't hold down a job.
Well, John, in all seriousness, one of the jobs that you've held down for the last decade has been championing civic leadership and in your involvement with CivicAction. So today we actually want to get into what has drawn you to this work. And we're in a room full of rising city builders and civic leaders. So I think the wisdom that you can impart would really help. So what has kept you involved in civic engagement and civic leadership? What sustains that?
Well, first of all, can I say also thank you all for being here today. I too have been to the studios for the last number of years, and I find them to be inspiring. And I don't think it's any accident at all that when we came to find a new CEO for CivicAction, we found it in the ranks of people who were involved with the ELN. I don't think that should be lost on anybody. I mean, it was a very deliberate and carefully done decision, as Mitzie was saying. I love the city, and I love the city region. I love this area, and I really believe, and we all say this, and we all read this, and other people say it, and you sort of think maybe it's sort of trite, but the fact is I don't think there's anywhere better to live in the entire world, than here.
Yeah.
And so I've always felt, first of all, I'm a person that I recognize I came from a relatively privileged background in terms of being able to have the things that a lot of people would want to have and having a good education and so on, and that I felt, and it's been sort of through generations in my family and many other families, that you should give back. So part of it's that, but part of it as well is that, you know, this place, this region we live in isn't going to stay as good as it is if we just sit back and assume it's going to stay as good as it is. And I think some of the things we might want to talk about today, whether it's the full integration of the diverse populations that live in this region, whether it's making sure we can really produce equality of access to opportunity, whether it's making sure we can put in place the transportation to make sure people can get to that opportunity, and on the list goes. If we don't address those issues, and I think the last panel, really, if you looked at one theme that came out of it as somebody sitting at the back listening, it's that we're just not having the kind of honest discussion we have to sort of make sure that kind of thing's going to happen, because there's always a way. And so, you know, to me, I've kept going because I felt that you know, I tried to do it in politics and I was unsuccessful, and that's fine. I mean, people have to stand up and try their best at this, but then if you really care about it, you'll carry on in some other way. And so I do it through CivicAction and also other charitable and community organizations, and through business, because there's a lot, as we just heard, that could be done by people in business urging their colleagues and confreres to do more.
So the breadth of the work that we do at CivicAction, it spans the environment, diversity, social inclusion, the economy. And we're just celebrating our 10th year this year, and we've been doing a lot of celebrating this week at various events. What are you most proud of?
Well, I said at the 10th anniversary, one of the 10th anniversary events, that you're not supposed to have favorites when you're, I don't know whether I'm the father or grandfather or uncle or whatever I am of this organization. I am a grandfather now, I have 2 grandchildren, but I do have one that I guess I'm proudest of, just because I've seen it as something that is so important, and it'll relate to some of the other discussion we have. And that's the diversity program. And only because I think we talk very proudly of the fact that 52%, or the number changes depending on who you ask, but certainly it's a majority of the people who live in this region were born outside the country. Many of those people have skin colors that are different, backgrounds, cultures, religions, and so on that are different. And I don't think we've done the job that we should have done when we invited, of course, all those people who came from elsewhere to come to this country, put them through, speaking of a rigorous process to get in the country. And then I think we've been too inclined to sort of say, well, great to have you here, good luck, and, you know, right if you get work. I mean, and I think, I mean, in all seriousness, it's not quite that bad, but sometimes pretty close if we wanted to admit it. And there's many other forms of integration. It isn't just about work. And so the diversity program, which has sought to you know, actively through leadership in particular, make sure that the ranks of the leadership in our society here in this region are representative of the people that live here in politics, in the law, in the judiciary, in education, in all kinds of different places. We just did supplier diversity this year. I'm proud of that, not just because we've sort of stood up and said it needs to be dealt with, but because we've actually embarked on programs that have produced results. So we can say, when it comes to a program we had, for example, under the heading of diversity, which was a child of CivicAction, that there are, I think, 150 or 200 people now appearing regularly on the media that look different than the old, you know, kind of group of people that used to appear as experts all the time. It was always the same crowd before, and you notice not many of them did have black or brown faces or were, you know, whatever, from diverse backgrounds. And now we've actually solved that one problem that exists, because people say, well, we don't know anybody that's other than that that's an expert on, you know, diabetes, and we found them somebody, and they're now appearing on television and on radio and so on. And it does two things. First of all, it puts those people into the leadership cadre themselves as spokespersons who are on television. And secondly, I would hope that it takes a lot of other kids whose skin may not be white or black or brown, but it almost doesn't matter, and says, you know what, I can be on television one day commenting on diabetes or whatever it is that they might do. And so I'm very proud of that project, and I think it's one that has to go forward, and there's a lot more to be done, as Ratna Omnivar said so well in the newspaper this morning. There's a lot more to be done, but we've made measurable progress on this.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's many of our DiverseCity Fellows are in the room today, which is part of the legacy of CivicAction. Mm-hmm. So we've focused today's session at Studio on enough talk, let's move. And it's all about transportation. Why was that chosen by CivicAction as the greatest priority for 2013?
Well, first of all, because the people at the summit told us that, and I guess we feel ourselves to be, you know, not servants of them, but I mean, there's no point having a summit and getting 1,000 people together from across the region in a room and then ignoring what they said in terms of what they thought your priority should be. And they said, without exception, that the #1 priority, and difficult to rank them oftentimes, but was transportation. Why did they say that? Well, I think they said that because it, and this is part of the discussion that doesn't happen as often as it needs to. It isn't just an economic issue. It's a powerful economic issue. In all the discussion you just heard, I don't need to repeat it, about people getting to and from work and being productive in their work and putting as much time as they can into the efforts to build bigger and better businesses and so on, and organizations they work in. #1, it's an economic issue. But it's also an access to opportunity issue. I mean, you know, you learn from the experiences you have, and I chaired for the TTC union some public meetings back, I guess about a year ago, about customer service. And I remember the people getting up, and they were talking about transit, but they were talking about how they had these jobs in a hospital in sort of the northeast part of the city, and they lived in the southwest part of the city region, and they described getting to work at 5:30 in the morning because they got to be at work at 6:30. And you know, look, this is good for me because I happen to live close to the subway. I'm blessed. So when it was all this survey done earlier about people's commutes, mine from where I live to downtown is 15 minutes, and I can walk like 30 seconds to the subway. But these people described, you know, 2 buses and a streetcar, and if you happen to miss the streetcar because there's only one that goes every half hour at that time of day, that you were sunk in terms of getting to work. And if those people are to remain employed and to have a chance to get up the ladder and so on, so transportation is not just an economic issue, it's an economic issue for the economy generally, but also for people working. It's a social issue. You know, it's a social issue. I mean, all the talk we heard in the video, all the talk we heard from people up here about time with family. Well, if one of the challenges we face today in terms of all the other issues that I end up talking about on a talk show, whether it's people having problems with drugs or mental health issues or this or that or the other thing, bullying, depends to some extent on things that go on in the household. If parents are spending the time commuting, we saw everybody standing up today, hours at a time, it's time taken away from family. So transportation to me was that overwhelmingly important issue, and to the delegates, obviously. And so to me, it was just obvious that they told us that. It was obvious that they were right. And so we took it on. And when we say we take it on, we don't have the answer, but I was actually happy to hear, hopefully they weren't just patronizing us because they were here visiting our session or your session, but that this discussion we've begun, your 32, is at least starting to put some of this stuff on the table. Yeah. There's a need for a lot more honesty, which I think we'll get to, but about all this, and that's what was referred to at the panel. But I think transportation was an obvious choice. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about the region. So over the last decade, there has been a lot of change. So we now have Mars, which is focusing on the innovation hub, bringing together all the research in health and sciences into one place that's really looking at commercialization and acceleration. We've invested billions of dollars in other types of infrastructure, in universities, in hospitals. We now have rebuilt the airport. We're working on the air rail link to Union Station. So what are some of those other challenges that you think are emerging for the next decade? What are some of those core issues that we need to be working on?
Well, I think if you put aside all the discussion we're having today about transportation, which is huge, I think there's probably three things I would name. One is, I think we have to start acting like a region. And this was another theme that came out of the summit last year, that, I think it was Meg that was talking about the realities of people going back and forth between 416 and 905, and now the numbers are such that it's almost as many people that are going out to the 905 who want to live downtown in Toronto as are going in. And we've got to start to think and act like a region, whether it's how we help to better integrate and faster integrate people who are newcomers to Canada, whether it is addressing issues of access to opportunity, whether it's addressing, all these issues are regional in nature, and why we now have all these governments all doing their own thing and kind of not really even talking to each other is astounding to me. That's number one. Number two, and by the way, I think every one of these dots is connected. The transit issue with the access to opportunity issue, with the integration of newcomers to Canada issue, with the, they're all connected, and nobody in government seems to often look at it that way because they're siloed. They're siloed between and among governments and sometimes often within governments. Number two is, and these are not in order, but I'm just said I'd name three. The second one is what I call the sort of emergence of two solitudes inside the city region. And it's ironic because in the Toronto region, the solitudes of those who are more isolated and suffering, struggling a little more and so on, are located in the suburban areas, and the people who are doing better, I call them comfortable, because I don't like to talk about rich and poor. I mean, it may be a reality, but it's not quite that stark a division. People who are more comfortable are living in the urban setting. But the bottom line is there are developing, if we want to be honest about this, two solitudes in our city region. It's happened elsewhere. Maybe the fact it's happened elsewhere should be a lesson to us as to why we would never want that to happen. I think it's inconsistent with Canadian values. I think it's inconsistent with the way we see ourselves, but it's happening. And I think the United Way has done some wonderful work, and I'm proud to have been a part of that. We've talked about it at CivicAction and taken some tangible steps over the years, but if you said, is there anybody really standing up in public life, and in the private sector for that matter, and saying, look, this is not in our best interests in any way, shape, or form, economically, socially, or otherwise? The answer is, name me a name. I mean, there's people you could name, but they're not people who are sort of leaders in these different parts of society. So I think that is fundamentally important as well. And now I've completely forgotten because my train of thought went on. There was a third. No, it's really important on this. I mean, whatever it is, it's important. And
so John.
Oh, I know what it was. I know what it was. It isn't even in these notes. Because you talk about universities, it is the pathetic job that I think we've done, given the investment we've made at matching skills needed by the economy with skills that are being produced. I mean, it's appalling, really, that when we make the investment, and you hear criticism of governments for not investing enough in post-secondary, particularly post-secondary education. I think we're investing quite a lot. You could always do more, of course. But if you just take what we're investing, it's not bad. And I've been prepared to say, as a politician who sat across the House from Dalton McGuinty, that there's lots of things he did wrong, and I could catalog some of those for you today, but I won't. I will tell you something he's done right, and that is that he and his government have made additional investments substantially in post-secondary education. But the question is, have we really focused on making sure those are producing the maximum benefit for us that really helps to build this region, to make sure that the skills that we have, including those of immigrants, that's part of the tragedy of the people who are coming to the country who actually, as you may know, I'm sure you do, have a higher level of educational attainment than the people who are already here, and yet where do they end up? Because the system hasn't really found a way to sort of fully integrate those skills as quickly as possible. They end up in places where they shouldn't be, sometimes including unemployment.
That's great. So, John, just to wrap up, as the father of CivicAction.
No, I'm not the father. That was David Pico was the father.
Well,
I was one of his.
You were one of the founding fathers of CivicAction.
All right. Okay.
What do you want to say to the emerging leaders, and what do you want to see from this group moving forward, perhaps even for the next decade?
This was an easy question for me to answer, given just even listening to the last session. we've got to have some honest discussions. You know what, to be quite frank, people my age, I'm 58 years old, so I'm part of the baby boom generation. And we have done well on some things, but we've really screwed up on some other things. And the stuff we've screwed up on is where we have sort of been prepared to make decisions without sort of answering the question of how to pay for them. We've given things away to people. When I say we've negotiated or granted things to people, including all of ourselves, without addressing the question, if you looked out 20, 30 years and simply did the math, you know, are these things sustainable for you? Because in an environment later on where there's a lot of us that are aging and are going to be reliant upon these services, and you're going to have to pay for it, and there's fewer of you to do so, it's going to be problematic. Straight mathematics tells you that. And yet, the one thing that came out of the panel earlier on, and I think is a huge problem that you can address, because I can tell from just dealing with you in my business life, in my broadcasting life, in my political and civic action life, you are prepared to be honest. You take people as they are, you take people as they come, take things as they come. You are going to have to stimulate and make sure that honest discussion happens. It was talked about up here in the context of transit, and the fact of the matter is so. I mean, the only thing that Paul, you know, perhaps didn't emphasize enough when he was explaining private financing, because I get so mad about this at the inherent lack of honesty of when people say, yeah, well, the private sector will build all that transit. Well, they can, and they would, except that anything you get from the private sector to build transit, as Paul did say, has to be paid back. And it's only going to be paid back out of one place. One way or another, it comes out of your pocket and mine, everybody else's. So it can be through a parking charge or through higher fares or through higher taxes. But the notion that there's some private money out there that's going to start building subways and say, we did that as a civic-minded gesture, business is business. Business is not there. They're there to be civic-minded, but they're there also to make money. And the same with the pension plans. I mean, the pension plans can invest in these kinds of things, but they have to earn a return that pays your pension. So in the end, we've got to start having on that and a whole bunch of other things. I would argue healthcare. I would argue, you know, what we're doing that's in terms of our values and living true to our values with respect to integrating newer Canadians, because I think we're talking a really good game on that without being consistent with the values we profess to be so proud of. So I think if there's one thing you could do, it's to be honest, and that requires, and I'm about to stop here, don't worry. So I'm a talk show host. I talk for 3 hours a day, so I mean, you know, I'm used to talking in long increments, but you have to be brave. You have to be brave. So when you work in a company, I know a lot of people would think, well, I'm sort of down here in the company, and I'm not going to go to the CEO and say, look, you have some responsibility. You can say it more politely than I'm about to say, but you have some responsibility as the leader of this company to make sure we're at the forefront of flex hours and flex working arrangements and so on to help with the transit issue. And by the way, when did our company stand up and make a statement as to how much it was costing us, you know, in terms of people and their jobs and their lives not to have proper public transit, and that it's time we sort of sucked it up and decided how we're going to pay for this? And the same with all these other issues. And they're not going to do that because Canadians are Canadians. One of the great statements made at the Ontario Economic Summit by one of our ELN people, and I was so proud that at that province-wide thing they took ELN, what, 4 or 5 or 6 people, and I was the moderator, and they talked about the future of the economy. And one of the very wise people that was from your ranks that spoke there said, part of our problem as Canadians is that we're too Canadian. And I knew the minute the words were out what they meant. We're such polite people, and we're so prepared to say, well, it's just easier if we can kind of paper things over, and maybe it'll all get better, and you know, so on and so on. You have to stand up and give us, frankly, a good swift kick in the ass and say, look, those of you who are still in positions of responsibility in business and in politics and so on, and we soon will be, but we don't want you to leave as big a mess as you're going to leave, so suck it up and make some of these decisions about paying for things and about what's sustainable going forward and about living true to our values in terms of integration of newcomers and taking people as they come and making sure that we respect and benefit from the diversity that is the Greater Toronto Region. And I think if we do that, you know, this place will be 20 years from now, because that's the time frame you got to look in. Every decision made or not made today about these things is going to be in effect 20 years from now, not today. So I'll be, as I often tell you, I say, Mitzie, I'll be an old man sitting on a porch of some nice old, hopefully some nice place for older people, gumming a biscuit. And whether they built subways or not won't be of that much matter to me. But it's got to be of matter to you and to your kids. And the decisions that are not being made today are decisions that will have their impact in 20 years, not tomorrow. You know, because we all sort of struggle along today. So be honest, be courageous about speaking up. I wasn't as courageous. You know what? It's true to say, I'm more courageous now because I've had the experience of being a talk show host. And they told me when I started, look, if you go on there and kind of go, well, on the one hand and on the other hand, and you know, this and that, and we'll all sort of sort it out and hold hands, you won't be very interesting. So you have, and they said, we know you have an opinion, you have to expose it. And having that job, which I won't have forever, but having that job has exposed me to the reality of doing that, and you feel better actually when you do it, when you have the courage to say, you know what, this is my view. And if you said to me, am I one of those people who are prepared to stand up and say right now, we got to pay for the transit, we got to decide, there's a list of tools, let's say there's 20, pick any 3 you want, but the answer of saying we don't like any of those is not on. It's
Great.
not on, and you have to help us have the courage and the politicians who are in elected office to do that and to give that answer. So.
Brilliant. So you've heard it here on ELNstudio 2012 from John Tory himself. Be courageous and be less polite. So with that, we're going to move into the next segment. Thank you so much, John.
Okay.